Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we'll be exploring spiritualism in the Jazz Age. With me is David Jaher, who is the author of The Witch of Lime Street, Seance, Seduction, and Harry Houdini in the Spirit World. This is an internet interview, and now I'll switch over to the internet video.
Welcome, David. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for making time available.
Thanks, Jeff. Great to be here.
You've written this incredible book about a time in history that hardly anybody alive, of course, remembers. And I don't think most people realize what an enormous fad spiritualism had become by the 1920s. It was a center of global attention.
Yeah, spiritualism really had a revival right after World War I. You had the war, of course, but you also had the influenza epidemic, which also took a disproportionate amount of young people. So the Western world had never seen so much death. And in reaction, you had this movement, the spiritualist movement, which is a religion essentially with only one tenet, and that is that it's possible to communicate with the dead. And the seance is really the only right. But really what gave it an air of legitimacy was that during the war you had some really respected Englishmen like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle who started, writing books called, The Vital Question and The New Revelation. He believed he was in touch with his own dead. During the war, he'd essentially lost every male member of his family who fought during the war. And he believed through mediums and through the seance, he was in touch with the spirits of these dead. Sir Oliver Lodge was perhaps England's most respected scientist during World War I. He had lost his son Raymond, and he wrote a book called Raymond, which became a smash bestseller. They say it was more popular in the trenches than the Bible during World War I. So these two Englishmen, some people called them the occult knights. They really became great champions of the spiritualist religion during World War I. And then after the war, they both came to America for very popular spiritualist tours. And they launched this spiritualist fad in America.
Sir Arthur Conan Doyle is the author of the Sherlock Holmes mystery stories and a man credited with not only being one of the most popular authors ever in the English language, but somebody with a great analytical mind, comparable to that of Sherlock Holmes himself. Absolutely. I mean, if you can imagine what it must have been like, here is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who's imbued with all the characteristics that people ascribe to Holmes. He's rational. He's a very respected speaker. Conan Doyle was one of the most popular speakers of his time. And, the English really looked to him to give things an air of credibility. He was a great social commentator, and he was also very popular in America. By this time, of course, he killed off Sherlock Holmes, and his real interest was in writing these spiritualist tracts. He became a protagonist, a person who made it his mission to popularize spiritualism.
Absolutely. That was his stated goal, the last decade of his life. This is what he wanted to devote himself to, and he made it his mission.
This would be a good time to introduce another protagonist in our story, the great magician, Harry Houdini. Right.
So Conan Doyle comes to America, and this was, I believe, 1922. And one of the first things he does is he challenges the editor of the Scientific American magazine to basically tell the public whether or not there's any scientific credence to spiritualism. Scientific American at that time was a really important magazine. They were sort of the 60 Minutes of its day. They reported on all the new trends. They were a magazine of invention. They, the public looked to them to tell them what was genuinely ahead of the curve and, what was just a lot of hooey. So, the Scientific American at that time was reporting on spiritualist phenomena and psychic phenomena on practically every issue. But Doyle's complaint was that, they were offering, they would have one commentator offer a pro view on spiritualism, a skeptic offer a negative view, but they themselves were not offering any kind of editorial opinion. So he challenged them to investigate themselves. So they reacted in a way that horrified Doyle. What they decided to do was they would mount an investigation, but they would do it in the guise of a contest. They put up a lot of money, more money than what was being offered for the Nobel Prize in Science, to any psychic or medium who could manifest genuine spiritualist phenomena before a committee of some of the top scientists in the United States. So the judges for this contest were William McDougall, who was the head of psychology at Harvard, Daniel Comstock, who was one of the top physicists at MIT and who invented Technicolor, and numerous other psychic investigators. And this contest just captured the public imagination and became one of the most controversial and popular contests of the jazz era. Now, the last judge in this contest was a world's expert on psychic fraud, and that was Houdini. The contest had to rely on Conan Doyle, whom they eventually assuaged, to basically endorse the contest and inspire mediums to take part in it. So that set him up on a collision course with Houdini. Now, Conan Doyle at this time was actually good friends with Houdini. Houdini had come to England right after World War I, and he'd done a very successful tour. But, his mother had died right before World War I, and he was passionately in love with his mother. He was never the same after her death. He wanted to get in touch with her spirit. And so he went to see Conan Doyle, and Conan Doyle started recommending mediums who he thought, could help Houdini and put him in touch with his mother. And Houdini never explicitly said this to Conan Doyle at the time, but he believed all these mediums were frauds, and they were exploiting him in the same way they were exploiting the post-war bereaved, and he thought it was this huge racket. So he also had a mission, and that was to show the public that spiritualism was really a very nefarious practice when it was practiced for money. And, he wanted to expose these psychic frauds.
Then we have to add to the mix a woman who became the most famous medium of her era, Marjorie Crandon. Oh, yeah, without question.
So while this contest goes on for a couple of years, and the judges, the investigators would unmask one ingenious fraud after another. In the meantime, this obscure, wealthy Boston socialite is developing her own psychic powers. She's investigated by Harvard psychology at that time. Because of the William James influence, Harvard psychology was basically just the department of Ghostbusters. I mean, they were a team of psychic investigators, and they went to Beacon Hill and they sat with her in her seances. And she wasn't a passive medium. She didn't just sit there and channel messages from the dead. She would manifest all these kind of violent poltergeist effects. They say that anything that wasn't tied down in the room during her seances took flight. The Harvard team was not able to explain what she was able to do. Then she and her husband, they take a tour of Europe and they sit with Charles Richet and Conan Doyle and all these top European investigators. And Conan Doyle talks her into throwing her hat in the ring and entering the Scientific American contest. So that's when her own star really rises, and she becomes not only the most popular medium in the world, but one of the 2 or 3 most popular women in the world, or at least in America. One of the things that drew me to this story was when I was looking at newspapers in 1924. This woman is on the front page of papers like the New York Times and the Boston Herald as often as the President of the United States.
And to boot, she was a rather attractive and somewhat flirtatious woman.
Yeah, no, Marjorie was extremely attractive. When you look at photographs of her today, they don't always capture that, and I think it really came from the inside. I mean, she had this ebullience that really kind of reflected the jazz era, and she was, incredibly charming and personable. And, she'd convinced many of these scientists, many of these judges that she was genuine. She was put on the front page of the New York Times, declared the first scientifically verified medium in history. But of course, the last judge whose scrutiny she has to pass to win this award is the magician Houdini. And Houdini, from the start, even before he'd sat with her, was pretty convinced that she was a fraud.
Houdini is famous for having debunked many frauds and even gotten people who were fraudulent mediums to publicly confess.
Absolutely. And Houdini would always say that, she was the toughest foe that he ever encountered. And Houdini, he's at the tail end of his career. Houdini was a great escape artist, but at this point he's in his late 40s, early 50s. He can't do all the incredible escapes that he could do when he was younger. And this was also a way of keeping his own popularity intact. In a sense, there was a very symbiotic connection between the two of them because, Houdini helped to make her famous. He would go before the public. He launched this anti-spiritualist tour where he would go from city to city and he would give his own rendition of Marjorie's phenomena, of course, through magic tricks. But, in some ways, that's when the story becomes even more interesting because Houdini was able to show how he, one of the 2 or 3 greatest magicians in the world, could replicate Marjorie's phenomena. But how is the society wife from Boston able to do through trickery what only, a handful of great vaudeville magicians should have been able to pull off?
Now, there's also a strong sense that she was quite sincere. She opened her home up to whoever wanted to investigate her. She became quite friendly, I gather, with Houdini, and one of her best friends couldn't believe that she would possibly cheat.
Yeah, I mean, I think the friend you're referring to is Mark Richardson, who was one of the most renowned scientists in Boston. I mean, that was her circle. Her circle were her husband was a very prominent Boston surgeon. As I mentioned, they lived on Beacon Hill. And, that's one of the reasons there was such a kind of credibility imbued on her because she didn't take money for her seances. If she was going to win the contest, she vowed to just donate the money to psychic research. She and her husband were very wealthy. They didn't need the money. I mean, what was their motivation to cheat? They had reputations. They were a fixture in Beacon Hill society. They were considered Boston aristocrats. And when you read the testaments at her seances, I mean, you have these records signed by some of the top physicians in Boston saying, for instance, at one of her seances, a table actually rose and then chased one of these physicians out of the room and down the hallway. I'm not saying that happened, but this was what is ascribed to in the seance records. And so again, it gives her this air of credibility that she did seem so incredibly sincere. She was a genuine spiritualist. She really thought she was doing good for people. And her husband, who considered himself a scientist, before she started manifesting this phenomena, he considered himself an atheist, a skeptic. And he made it his mission to basically bring his wife's gifts before the public, so that people could see that, it was possible to communicate with the dead. He considered himself the Galileo of psychic science. And, at that time, because so many scientists, even Nobel Prize scientists were, linking hands in the seance room, it really seemed that there was this new, scientific discovery that would be, one of the most major breakthroughs in human existence. Charles Richet, who invented the term ectoplasm, was a Nobel Prize winning scientist, and he had sat with Marjorie and thought she was genuine.
As I understand it, her husband, Ray Crandon, a surgeon, also started out as an atheist, and she herself had no particular interest in spiritualism. I believe in your book it was Sir Oliver Lodge who provoked their interest.
Yeah, absolutely. Oliver Lodge, when he came to America in 1920, it's interesting because he comes to America, I believe, January 1st, 1920, just as the jazz era is beginning. And, people think of the jazz era as being this period of gaiety and decadence, which it was. But there was also this occult renaissance, which took place at that time, due in large part to Sir Oliver Lodge and later to Conan Doyle. And so Oliver Lodge comes to Boston and he speaks at Symphony Hall. And I guess on a lark, Leroy Crandon goes to hear him speak. And, he's just blown away by this lecture. The fact that, Oliver Lodge was almost like the Thomas Edison of England. He was a great inventor. He invented the spark ignition for the internal combustion engine. He'd sent radio waves before Marconi. He was a great physicist. He was a great chemist. Everybody had heard of Oliver Lodge. And the fact that he believed in spiritualism and, was coming forth with, not ghost stories, but with, these scientific theories for why it worked. And, he was presenting his experimental evidence. This to a deductive thinker like Crandon, this was very impressive. So after the lecture, he approaches Lodge and he asks them if they can have lunch and they do, and they develop a friendship, and Oliver Lodge suggests further reading for him. And before you know it, Crandon is conducting his own seances on Lime Street where he lived. And that's when it was discovered that his own wife has these psychic powers.
She sort of attended a seance on a whim, and that's when it all started for her.
Yeah, she had gone to see a spiritualist minister, a psychic in Boston, and this medium had, she believed, come across with information about her dead brother, which, she couldn't understand how anybody could have obtained that information or even had known how her brother had died. And that basically inspired her own fascination with spiritualism, although I think her, her husband's interest as well, was the more dominating, kind of spark for her. But her husband thought, this seance she had with the spiritualist, he dismissed it. He thought this guy had just obtained the information in some way. But that was basically her first exposure to spiritualism. Prior to marrying Dr. Crandon, she seemed to be fairly religious, but, she was a Christian. She attended church. She played cello. I think she sang in the choir. Her ex-husband had said, she played cello. I never knew of her to, have any kind of interest in the spirits before this phase.
Was her deceased brother, who then became her regular spirit guide in the seances.
Yeah, her brother had died right before World War I. And she, was strongly connected to him. And, when a psychic, when a psychic is conducting a seance, typically they go into a trance. They're called trance mediums. And they take on the guise of someone who's dead, who acts as the spirit guide to the afterlife. And in her case, her spirit guide was her dead brother. Now, in those days, in Boston, a woman was not even allowed to sit on juries. Women weren't allowed in most speakeasies. A woman's life was in some ways very, very much socially circumscribed, especially a Beacon Hill lady. She wasn't expected to swear. So when she channeled her dead brother, there was a great deal of gender role play going on, because now she could channel the persona of her brother. Her brother, was very pugnacious and acerbic, and he had this baldy personality, and he would say things and do things which, a Beacon Hill lady, in terms of her own position, would have been unacceptable for her to say these things.
she participated in the course of that decade of the 1920s, essentially hundreds of seances, and you've gone through the literature and found detailed records for many, many seances that you document in your book.
Yeah, it's interesting the way her powers develop, either that or if you believe she was a fraud, the way her trickery develops, because, she starts off, as I mentioned, manifesting all these kind of poltergeist effects. There'd also, you'd be in her seances and, there'd be these cold winds that would seem to come out of nowhere and buffet the sitters. There'd be these disembodied voices that would come from all parts of the room. There'd be these spirit lights which would zip across the room. Tables would rise and move and propel. The chairs would fly. The typical kind of seance effects. Lampshades and books would fall. Lamps would rise. But then as she, further on in the 1920s, as the Scientific American begins to investigate her more, she would actually try to manifest what was considered the holy grail of psychic investigation, which was to manifest a ghost, a full apparition. And she would start with these ghostly appendages like Walter's hand, spirit hand would come forth. This was very controversial at the time, of course.
The history of spiritualism long before the 1920s is filled with examples of fraud. There are many, many fraudulent mediums were exposed. So the psychical researchers of that era were sensitive to this. They were looking for fraud.
Physical mediumship is it's something that you rarely see done publicly today. There are channels, there are people who are supposedly in touch with the dead and they communicate through these voices. But in those days, you had what were called physical mediums who would manifest physical phenomena. What the Scientific American wanted was phenomena that could be scientifically validated. So they wanted, to see physical expressions of spirit phenomena. They wanted to see the spirits through some sort of psychic force, cause these things to happen in the seance room, cause these objects to fly around the room. They wanted to see the physical manifestation of ectoplasm. So, you rarely see that today. The last physical medium who I know of who received any kind of notoriety was Uri Geller, who, famously appeared on the Johnny Carson show. And, his thing was that he could, bend forks and spoons through psychic power. That's just the kind of thing that was being done during the 1920s. But, of course, Johnny Carson was a trained magician. And, in what must have been one of the most awkward moments in television history, Geller goes on the Johnny Carson show and, these spoons and forks are placed before him and nothing happens. So that's the last example that I can think of so far as a real important popular demonstration of physical phenomena. But, this was going on all the time during the 1920s.
David, what got you started on this particular journey, writing this book?
Well, I've always been interested in Houdini, not so much in terms of his magical career, but more as just a kind of a cultural icon. When you think about the 1920s, Houdini was almost without question, between the time Teddy Roosevelt dies in 1919 and the time Lindbergh flies across the Atlantic in 1927, Houdini was the most recognizable American in the world. And Marjorie, as I've already mentioned, becomes one of the most popular females. So here you have this psychic and this magician who are two of the most topical Americans during the era. And I just thought that was incredible. And, when you read Houdini biographies, Marjorie, typically receives a chapter, but nobody had ever really written a full-fledged book about her. And, I haven't written a biography, but what really interested me was their rivalry. The New York Review of Books, in reviewing my book, they called it one of the most incredible rivalries in American history. when Houdini faced off with Marjorie. You have in myth, you have these kinds of encounters where you have a virile male figure like Odysseus, a heroic male figure who must face off against a sorceress like Circe. And, Houdini was not just a magician. He was considered almost the personification of American vitality. He was supposedly virile. He had this incredible body. People basically imbued onto him the same kind of heroism as they would on a great explorer or on a military hero. So, it sort of taps into these mythic kind of encounters. As I mentioned, you had, Circe and Odysseus, Morgan Le Fay and King Arthur, Morgan Le Fay, a sorceress who steals Excalibur and makes, Arthur impotent. So here you have Houdini, facing off against this great modern female sorceress. And, she was also, as he himself, said, she had what he would describe as this mythic kind of seductive, aura about her. Just as Circe, seduced Odysseus's men and turned them into swine. Houdini thought that Marjorie had seduced all these great scientists who declared her genuine. She had seduced them, perhaps she was sleeping with them, and basically they were doing her bidding, and Houdini vowed to be the one male who could resist her. Now, it's very interesting because Houdini was considered this, as I mentioned, this very strong, powerful figure. Yet, he had this vaguely asexual relationship with his wife. They never had children. He was a movie star who supposedly was not able to kiss his leading ladies on camera. So he's coming up against a woman who, is rising almost to a level of fame that he has, but, through what he believes are magic tricks. So she's sort of muscling on his territory, but at the same time, she represents something else which he feels very threatened by, and this powerful, female sexuality. So Houdini, there's a number of different in medieval times, magicians were the enemies of witches. They were the ones who basically, ferreted out witches and reversed their spells. So, you have that. You also have a class conflict because Houdini, was born an impoverished immigrant. He grew up to become, this rich, famous figure. But, when he's encountering Marjorie and her husband, they're a part of the circle, which, there was a certain amount of anti-Semitism. Houdini was a Jew, and Marjorie's husband made this comment, my only regret is that this low-minded Jew has any claim to the word American. So there was not only the gender conflict, the ancient conflict, but also this class conflict. The Crandons were just the kind of people that Houdini wanted to unveil as frauds.
The 1920s is a period of great scientific discovery as well. In fact, Sir Oliver Lodge was indirectly responsible for Arthur Eddington's confirmation of Einstein's theory.
That's the great paradox. I mean, you think of what's going on right before World War I. You have this era where science seems to have the answer for everything. I mean, all these horrible medieval plagues, diphtheria, cholera, science is developing, antidotes to them. And not only that, I mean, it feels like a very progressive period. You hadn't, right before World War I, Europe hadn't seen a major war since the Franco-Prussian War a half century before. America had not fought a major war since the Civil War, which is again more than a half century before. So it feels like society is really progressing. There aren't going to be any more of these horrible wars. All these medieval plagues are a thing of the past. Scientific discoveries are just, it's just incredible. All this new technology, the airplane, the automobile, the radio. So you have this incredible era of discovery and scientific breakthroughs. But then what happens? You have this apocalyptic war, And then on the heels of the war, you have this medieval plague, which just decimates society. So that leads to this occult revival, which is going on contemporaneously with this great new reverence for scientific discovery. So you did have a number of great scientists. We've mentioned a few of them who really took an interest in spiritualism. But it seeped down even to scientists you would not associate with this. The author Upton Sinclair wrote a best-selling book called, I believe it's called Mental Radio, and who wrote the introduction to the book. Albert Einstein wrote the introduction to it. Not somebody who you would associate with an interest in psychic phenomena, but that's what it was in the 1920s.
Also, I think it's interesting that Scientific American, today we think of it as a very prestigious scientific publication. I suppose back in the 1920s it was a bit more of a popular magazine.
So one of the reasons the Scientific American decided to launch this contest was when Einstein arrived in America, here is this little scientist who came to America and the New York City gave him a ticker tape parade, and people were fascinated by Einstein, but nobody really understood what he was doing. People didn't really the general population didn't understand relativity. So Scientific American decides to launch a contest which will be designed to award prize money to whoever can come up with the best popular explanation for what Einstein does. Now, you wouldn't think that a contest like that would become that popular, but the newspapers picked it up and they gave it a lot of press, and it became enormously popular. And that sort of indicates why Scientific American was such a sort of almost faddish magazine in those days, because science was, the things that science was doing in those days, or the things that science was seemed to be responsible for explaining, or inventions that were coming about in those days. These were the things that were the stuff of magic. The electricity in those days, it seemed as magical a phenomena as anything spiritualists were doing. So, there was just this wonder at these new scientific discoveries, which just gave a lot of popularity to magazines like the Scientific American.
On the committee of judges appointed by the Scientific American to evaluate mediums, they included representatives from the Society for Psychical Research.
Yeah, well, that was the idea. They wanted great scientists, but they also, wanted great psychic investigators. One of them was Walter Prince, who was basically the lead psychic investigator for the Society of Psychic Research. Then there were two. There was the American Society for Psychical Research, and then there was the SPR in England, which was sort of the parents' outfit. And in those days, the American Society for Psychical Research was very respected. You didn't have to be a scientist to be a member, or be a ghost hunter to be a member. Teddy Roosevelt was a member. Mark Twain was a member. Anybody with an interest in psychic phenomena and whether it was possible to communicate with the dead, was likely to become a member of the American Society for Psychical Research. So, these weren't perceived to be a bunch of silly ghost chasers. They were scientists. Walter Prince, who became a judge in the Scientific American contest, he had 3 degrees from Yale. He was a psychologist, and he had never encountered a medium who he truly thought was genuine, perhaps with one exception. And that was this young girl who he eventually adopts. And that would be probably the only one he thought was genuine prior to the Scientific American contest. So the officers for this American Society for Psychic Research, weren't considered a bunch of credulous ghost hunters. They were considered, skeptical people who were interested in seeing if it was possible to scientifically substantiate this kind of phenomena.
Amongst the psychical researchers themselves, there was a lot of controversy. There were some who really thought that Marjorie Crandon was a fraud, and there were others who were convinced she was genuine.
Yeah. There were those who thought she was both a fraud and genuine. I don't want to give away too much of the story, but she is successful in convincing a number of these investigators on the jury, on the Scientific American jury, that she should be awarded the prize. And then, of course, Houdini enters the contest and presents, when Houdini comes to Boston in the summer of 1924 and begins to sit with her, I mean, as I mentioned before, it launches one of the great rivalries in American history. And Houdini, he believed that he appears in Boston and he presents, I think it was 20,000 in bonds to the mayor of Boston in this great public spectacle. And he vows that he will be able to stop Marjorie's phenomena. And if he's not able to, then the city of Boston can keep this $20,000 in bonds. So, he sits with her. And in those days, it was believed that a woman or any medium needed a certain amount of privacy to manifest her ectoplasm during a seance. So she would typically be put in a spirit cabinet, which was basically just this wooden enclosure with apertures for her arms to stick out so that she could, hold hands in a seance circle, and there'd usually be a curtain in front. But Houdini thought that lended itself to fraud. So he invented his own spirit cabinet, which looks, it looks like some sort of medieval torture device. It basically encloses her so that she's completely restrained, except for her head. And so Houdini puts her in this spirit cabinet, which looks like a medieval stock. And, what happens during the first seance? I mean, he's vowed that there will be no phenomena. And within a few minutes, the entire upper part of the cabinet just spontaneously falls apart and falls to the floor. A spirit bell, which is put out of the reach of the medium, begins to ring. So, at that point, Houdini really realized that, he had his work cut out for him.
But he didn't give up. He persisted and claimed that eventually he would get to the bottom of all this.
Absolutely. Houdini was not one to ever give up. And, he was convinced that she was a fraud and he was going to prove it.
At the same time, as I recall from your book, she felt closer to Houdini and had more respect for him in some ways than for the parapsychologists and psychical researchers who came to observe her.
Yeah, she made that comment. She and Houdini had a love-hate relationship. I mean, they were great rivals, but Marjorie was not the kind of person that I can't think of any example where anybody had any real enmity toward her. I mean, she was so likable, and such a pleasing personality. And, Houdini claimed he was going to be the one to resist her, but there are photographs of Houdini standing in front of, her house on Line Street and they're holding hands. Houdini absolutely, liked her. She liked him. Now this wouldn't be, if you read Houdini's comments, they sound horrible. You wouldn't think that there was, any kind of personal affection between the two of them. And, at the same time, Marjorie respected him. She's used to conducting these seances for these professors and these scientists who, were very sexually drawn to her. And, they would, she's going to imagine the situation, these hot, stifling seance rooms. She's conducting these seances wearing nothing but her kimono. There's all this physical control that these scientists say are necessary in order to ensure that she's not cheating. So their hands all over her. Houdini never laid a hand on her. And Houdini she respected, because she thought he was, he was a virile, powerful figure who, she herself was attracted to.
I'm under the impression that people like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and others were very hopeful that Houdini would come around the same way that many others had and would endorse spiritualism, and it would be a great victory for their movement.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Before Marjorie, became Doyle's great psychicope, and in a sense, the world's great psychicope. He thought Houdini was going to be the one who was really going to become the world's first recognized, truly outstanding psychic medium. Not that there hadn't been psychics before who'd garnered a great deal of publicity and notoriety, but nothing like Houdini and Marjorie. And Houdini, you had scientists who would appear at Houdini's magic shows, and they really believed, when they would see him seemingly walk through a wall, that he was dematerializing himself. They couldn't explain these magical effects, and some of them really believed that he had genuine supernatural powers. Conan Doyle absolutely believed that. And what he said to Houdini is, you're traveling around the world, you're looking for a psychic who can give you examples of phenomena, supernatural phenomena that you can believe in, but you yourself are exhibiting this in every performance. Conan Doyle believed that Houdini had these powers, and he was in denial that he just, couldn't accept it. Reasons he helped Houdini was he thought Houdini was his partner in really attracting publicity towards spiritualism, and Houdini was going to become a spiritualist. And one of the first things that Conan Doyle does when he arrives in America in 1922 is he goes to see this movie Houdini had just made, and the movie is called The Man from Beyond, which is about Houdini, the character Houdini plays, trying to resuscitate a romance with a woman he had known from a prior lifetime. So it had the strong spiritualist message. And at the end of the movie, the last minutes of the movie, the character Houdini plays starts reading passages from Conan Doyle's book on spiritualism. It really looked like Houdini himself was a convert at that time.
In retrospect, looking back at the Marjorie mediumship from the distance of nearly 100 years, it's still kind of a mystery, it seems to me. After reading your book, and I've certainly read many other pieces about this particular case, it's inconclusive, I would say, as to whether she was authentic medium or not, or probably, like many others, a mixture of the two.
Yeah, I don't think there's any question but that she cheated at times. Now, but the question is, did she cheat all the time? And I think the answer to that really lies in many ways, according to, what your own viewpoint is. If you believe that there is no such thing as psychic phenomena, you're going to study the Marjorie case and come away feeling she was a great imposter and a great fraud. If you're more inclined to feel, that there is such a thing, then, she really could be the poster girl for, legitimacy of this kind of study of psychic research.
Mm-hmm. Now, you approach the subject matter, though, I know you have a background in the fine arts and you're a superb writer. I think your goal was to really approach it as a historian, not as a psychical researcher yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Basically what I wanted to do is just present the story, as if, the reader themselves were in the seance room and experiencing what these scientists observed, and people can decide for themselves. But I try not to offer an editorial viewpoint as to whether or not, because I think that's one of the things when you read the Houdini biographies, many of which are written by magicians, they just dismiss her out of hand, when they do write about Marjorie. And, one of the things that I'm kind of proud of from writing this book is, I've received correspondences from people like the magician Teller who, really liked the book. And then, I've also, received communications from people from Spiritualists who really sort of, respect the fact that, this is a book that gives Marjorie fair treatment.
You've created openings for all your readers to kind of enter into the story, which I think is very admirable in a writer. I think one of the most interesting aspects of this case is how, in a way, it was instrumental in giving birth to the modern science of parapsychology in an odd way, because J.B. Rhine, who is credited with as being the founder of contemporary parapsychology, investigated Marjorie and came away convinced that that was not the way to study this phenomena.
Yeah, absolutely. J.B. Rhine sat with her, I think it might have been 1927, and he was not impressed. To be fair to Marjorie, this was a time where her own powers, if you believe in them, would have been waning. She was a semi-alcoholic. She'd been discredited in some measure, or actually in a large measure, by Houdini. So he believed that, it was really time to take psychic research out of the seance room, out of this realm of ghosts and goblins and this, out of this whole kind of occult reference, and really conduct seance research in universities, where you measure phenomena, according to more of the kind of scientific rigor. So he started, basically his own department at Duke, which is around for many, many decades.
Yeah, and William McDougall, who was one of the judges in the Scientific American contest, ended up going to Duke University and bringing J.B. Rhine there to establish the parapsychology laboratory.
In those days, there was sort of a great debate over whether or not psychic research and psychic phenomena should be the realm of psychology. And, McDougall was one of maybe the most respected English-speaking psychologist in the world in those days, or whether it was the realm of physics. Rhine, I believe, was a botanist and a biologist. McDougall, as you mentioned, was the one who brought him over to Duke. But, Rhine and McDougall also had basically, I think, different perspectives on psychic phenomena to a certain extent and how to go about conducting these kinds of experiments.
In fact, he was named after Joseph Banks, a famous British botanist. Mm-hmm. So it was, you could say botany was in his blood, but
right.
He converted, became the founder of an entirely new discipline.
And by the way, when he came out against Marjorie, that was also a huge kind of expose too. So, it wasn't just Houdini who did a lot of damage to Marjorie. In the end, as I mentioned, Marjorie and Houdini fought this fierce rivalry, and in a way, before, during a seance, Marjorie's dead brother, Walter, who, was her spirit control, made the comment that, first of all, he vowed Houdini was going to die and die violently, for this, what the spiritualists believed was an attack against their religion, and for, basically attacking the religion in a way that they thought was blasphemous. So Walter comes through during a seance, but he also makes this comment that when Houdini dies, it's going to be a great blow to spiritualism and psychic research. And what he meant by that was Houdini had, through his own popularity and through this mission of his to discredit spiritualism, had attracted so much attention to the religion and so much attention to the study. So what Walter meant was it was going to, despite the fact that Houdini was public enemy number one to the spiritualists, Walter was saying that when he dies, you're going to see a real wane in popularity to this movement, to this in psychic research, and that's exactly what happened. It's very interesting because you could, in some ways, make the argument that Houdini and Marjorie were so symbiotically connected that they, in a sense, destroy one another. Marjorie, is I don't want to reveal the end, but let's just say her public reputation is greatly damaged by Houdini. Now, at the same time, Houdini is receiving death threats. Marjorie is so beloved and so popular, and she has this she's almost like a cult leader in some ways. And she becomes the avatar for the spiritualist religion, and she has these, scores of very loyal followers, and Houdini is receiving death threats. Ultimately, he is assaulted in his dressing room by somebody who may or may not have been a member of the spiritualist movement. He was a divinity student who had a real interest in the occult. And he assaulted Houdini. Houdini always claimed that he could take any kind of blow to the stomach. And so this divinity student started asking Houdini about miracles from the Bible. And since Houdini thought mediums and psychics were frauds, did that mean that the great prophets from the Bible were frauds too? And, their great miracles were just magic tricks. And Houdini said he didn't like to talk about that kind of thing. So then the student changes the subject and says, well, I understand you can take any kind of blow to the stomach. Do you mind if I try you? And Houdini would never refuse any kind of challenge. So he accepted. But Houdini was reclining on the sofa, and before he could get up and brace himself, this divinity student, who was also an amateur boxer, laid into him. And, Houdini always claimed he could transcend any kind of physical malady. So that evening and subsequently he went on with his performances in Montreal and Detroit. But he had 104-degree fever. He was fainting between acts. Eventually his wife finally is able to convince him to check himself into the hospital. But by that time it's too late. And what the surgeons at the time determined is that blow actually burst his appendix, and he died of trauma-induced appendicitis.
It's a tragic death, and of course, he's remembered as one of the great magicians of all time. And spiritualists today are still waiting to see if Houdini will perform his final escape and create an authentic message from the afterlife. I think it has yet to happen.
It's yet to happen. Yeah, Houdini died on Halloween. And, that just shows how interesting Houdini's perspective on psychic phenomena was. He really did want to believe it was possible to communicate with the dead. And he formed these compacts with his friends and with his wife so that, if he died, he wanted there to be some sort of message that only they knew, that he would communicate from the beyond, or they would communicate from the beyond, so that people would know it was a genuine communication. Now, as it happens, there was a medium named Ford who did communicate that code that Houdini had made with his wife.
Arthur Ford.
Arthur Ford. I believe this might have been in 1928. It was within a year or two of Houdini's death. But that's also very controversial. Many people believe that Ford may have been able to finagle the code he became very close friends with her during this time. And, Houdini's widow basically was just this, mentally disturbed alcoholic for about a year after Houdini's death. And some people believe that Ford, who sort of became close to her, was able to finagle the code from her. But, Houdini died on Halloween, and every year, he never had any direct descendants because he didn't have children. But every year, his sort of the people who inherited his magic act, his brother and later other magicians, would get together and try to, contact his spirit. It's interesting because Houdini died on Halloween. Marjorie died the day after Halloween. And perhaps the third most important character in the book, the editor of Scientific American, died the day before Halloween. So, even in death, these people sort of, helped imbue this whole story with a kind of occult aura.
Well, David Jaher, it's been a pleasure reviewing this fascinating and largely forgotten episode of history. You've done a great job of describing it, a beautifully written book. I want to encourage our viewers to take a look at it. Thank you for being with me.
Thanks, Jeff. It's been great talking to you.